Now, a stream such as this, as we'll talk about a little bit later, has primarily species, especially in these headwater areas, that require very high amounts of oxygen. This continual turbulence associated with the riffles and the small falls guarantee that there's a tremendous amount of oxygen cycled in. Also, along those same lines in the headwaters, because it is relatively shallow, that is, there's a lot of surface area between water and the atmosphere, this means that the atmosphere and the oxygen come in contact with the water a great deal, much more than it would downstream where it's much deeper. So that there is rarely ever any oxygen problems in the headwaters of these streams. Also, because there's very little organic matter, because there's relatively low in nutrients and not a lot of production, there's not a great deal of buildup of organic matter. Most of it that comes in is from the neighboring communities, the forests around it. That means that there's not a lot of decomposition. That also tends to keep that oxygen level relatively high. The rocks are important because they provide basically two things. First, they provide a substrate for the invertebrates. Most of the invertebrates, and as I mentioned, we'll talk about those in a little while, require good substrate for attachment. They live on the bottoms of the rocks. They'll come up occasionally towards the surface to feed on the diatoms and algae, and this is ideal substrate for them. It also provides excellent cover for the fish species, and again, primarily we're talking about trout. This is especially important during this low water period because trout are very vulnerable to, or at least feel very vulnerable to, overhead predation. As we pulled up today to fish, film here, Freudian slip, not a Freudian slip, but a slip of the tongue. We're usually pulling up to fish. Today we're pulling up to film. As we pulled up to film today, we noticed a kingfisher working the surface of the water. Well, if trout don't have cover, that kingfisher is going to nail them. So this substrate of boulders and rocks is very important. You'll notice in other areas that there's finer gravel. This is also significant because trout need good gravel or small rubble to spawn in. They can't spawn in boulders or rocks. So it's this combination of substrate that makes this ideal trout water. Let's talk a little bit about some of the chemical aspects of a habitat such as this. We've already discussed oxygen. Species that require high amounts of oxygen thrive in this kind of a habitat. Let's discuss pH for a moment. This type of stream, a freestone stream, especially near the headwaters, is one that's highly vulnerable to acid precipitation. We mentioned the fact that there's very little sedimentary input. Well, this also means that there's very little buffering capacity. It's very limited. There are not the carbonates and bicarbonates that we need normally to provide a great deal of buffering for acidity. Because of that, a stream like this always runs slightly acid to begin with because of naturally formed carbonic acid and cannot cope with the input of acid precipitation. Sulfuric acid, as we've talked about, a very strong acid, in this stream in high amounts would be devastating. This becomes particularly critical for these streams during the spring runoff, when large amounts of acidity can build up in the snowpack and be released in large bursts into the stream, and a big slug of acid could have a major effect on the life in the stream. What's this stream going to be like further down? Well, remember, as we go further downstream from Woodland Valley into the Esopus and down the Esopus, the whole character of the stream changes. First, as far as its physical shape is concerned, the gradient drops considerably. It is no longer a steep gradient. And in fact, when you get down into the valley, the Esopus has almost no gradient at all. It is almost all pools, very, very limited riffles. Well, right away you're decreasing the amount of turbulence, therefore decreasing the oxygen intake or input into the stream. Also down in this zone, there's a great increase in temperature. Warmer water holds less oxygen to begin with. you also have a much greater production of organisms in general. Now remember, although this is not receiving a lot of limestone input, it is receiving nutrients from the land around it, allochtonously. That means that this stream continually gets richer and richer the further it goes downstream. When it gets to the valley, it starts picking up some domestic pollution, field fertilizer runoff, all of this making that habitat much richer. Of course, a richer habitat means greater production, as you remember from previous lectures. A lot of plants, a lot of animals feeding on those plants, aquatic organisms, and therefore a tremendous amount of decomposition and loading. This means a great removal of oxygen from the water by the bacteria. So the warmer water, the lack of turbulence, and the great increase in decomposition all have the effect of reducing the amount of oxygen. This, of course, is going to have a major effect on the change in the species, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. Now, how long can you maintain the trout stream temperature? Well, something we haven't talked about is the canopy or the tree cover over the stream. Now, we happen to be filming in a cleared area, but you'll find that most of the headwaters area usually have a relatively dense coverage of vegetation or a canopy over the top, which also tends to reduce the amount of heating. As you go further and further downstream, the canopy opens more and more, and of course that also has a tendency to increase the temperature, decrease the oxygen, and therefore change the whole structure of the biota.